It began quietly. As most things do, a single woman stepped out into the summer heat of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, in the month of July, 1518. She began to dance, alone, unprovoked, and critically, without music. She danced, in the street. Her name was Frau Trophäa. The stories claim that no one knew why she started. There was no celebration, no wedding procession, no festival. Only the slowly building sound of her feet slapping the cobblestones under the dry, glaring sun. And she didn't stop. A town in a time of tension. To understand the dance, you must understand the stage it was set on. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city weighed down by fear. Fear of starvation, fear of sin, fear of the devil, the plague, and the wrath of God. The harvests had been unkind, the weather irregular, and the social order, like the bridge spanning the Ill River, strained but intact. Barely. The printing. Press had arrived, but not yet the Reformation in full swing. Superstition ruled with equal force as scripture. Medicine was more often a blend of prayer and bloodletting than anything like healing. Life was a daily negotiation with discomfort, and so when a woman began dancing in the street, for hours, then days, it was not seen as a medical emergency, but as a spiritual one, a public spectacle. Grows within days. Dozens joined her. Eyewitness accounts, filtered through the decades and often softened into folklore, claim that within a week, over 30 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. By the end of the month, that number may have reached 400. This was not joyous, it was not rhythmic, it was not celebratory, it was compulsive, and it was destructive. People danced until their feet bled. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others continued despite obvious signs of injury or delirium. A few reportedly danced to their deaths, and all the while, city officials watched in horror and confusion. You may imagine yourself watching this unfold from the safety of a shaded porch or behind a warped wooden shutter. But ask yourself, would you understand any of it? Or would you be tempted to believe what many did then? That these dancers were being punished, or perhaps even possessed? What would you have believed? To modern ears, the idea of dancing to death sounds like metaphor or hyperbole, but to a medieval citizen of Strasbourg, it was something else entirely. A known affliction, something that had happened before. Cases of dancing mania had erupted in the past, in Aachen, in Cologne, even as far back as the 14th century, along the Rhine. Theories in 1518 ranged from overheated blood to demonic possession to divine punishment. Her common belief was that the afflicted had offended Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name had long been linked with strange bodily afflictions and spasms. To cure the dancers, the town's authorities, acting on the advice of local physicians, opted for an unexpected course of action. They built a stage, yes, a literal stage. Musicians were hired. Space was cleared. Dancers were encouraged to continue. The prevailing theory was that they had to dance it out, that by indulging the mania rather than resisting it, the afflicted would recover. Imagine that, collapsing from exhaustion, muscles convulsing, limbs trembling, and being encouraged to continue by flute players and drummers hired by the town council. Could you have survived it? Pause here. Let the reality sink in. In a city of fewer than 20,000 people, hundreds were overtaken by this compulsion. You might imagine yourself immune, watching from a distance, but consider how fear and stress act on a community in an age when mass trauma was the norm. Crop failures, pestilence, religious anxiety. You may have been more vulnerable than you think. Maybe you would have joined in. Not at first, but on the third or fourth day after sleepless nights, watching neighbors twitch and spin in the square, after hearing the drumming, night after night, after hunger wore away your skepticism, after prayer failed to soothe the growing dread. Maybe you'd feel your foot begin to tap. Maybe it wouldn't stop. The modern diagnoses historians have long puzzled over what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. Some believe it was a mass psychogenic illness, a kind of collective stress response exacerbated by fear and superstition. Others suggest ergot poisoning, caused by a hallucinogenic mold on rye, which can induce spasms and hallucinations. But that theory lacks consistent evidence. Still others believe it was a form of trance-like behavior triggered by extreme psychological distress. Essentially, the city had been broken by tension. The people cracked not with screams or riots, but with dance. And here lies the boring truth. No single answer fully satisfies. In fact, the Strasbourg dancing plague remains one of history's most peculiar unsolved medical mysteries. A mix of physical, psychological, and social factors tangled together in a tapestry of 16th century suffering. You in the crowd, it's tempting to assume you'd be an observer. But most people weren't. Most people were in it, living day to day, eating barley gruel, hauling water, fearing hellfire, trying not to fall sick, or watching helplessly as their family members joined the swelling crowd of dancers in the square. Could you resist the pressure to believe it was supernatural? Could you stomach the medical response, which was often worse than the illness? Could you, in fact, survive the heat, the hunger, the sleepless nights, and the growing sense that the world had tipped ever so slightly off its axis? Or would you, too, start to dance? In most cities, music stops with the setting sun. In Strasbourg, during that strange and searing summer of 1518, it didn't. The drumming continued through dusk. The flutes moaned into the night air. And feet, bare, blistered, or bound, kept tapping, spinning, stumbling in strange, involuntary rhythm. This wasn't a festival, it was a crisis. But the city's response? More music, doctors, drums, and misdiagnosis. When Frau Trophea first danced, her way into history, local authorities didn't call for exorcism. Instead, they consulted doctors, what passed for medical authorities at the time. The consensus was clear, though wholly bizarre to modern ears. This was a blood problem, too much blood. Overheated humors. A condition brought on, they said, by internal combustion. In 1518, humoral theory, an idea stretching back to Hippocrates, was still medical gospel. Your body, it was believed, was a delicate balance of 4 fluids: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Imbalance led to illness. Excess blood was thought to cause hot diseases, mania, fever, even lust. The solution: restore balance. Let it out, but not by leeches or lancets, as was often the case. No, this time the prescription was music. The physicians advised that the afflicted needed to purge themselves through more dancing. Their blood, metaphorically, needed to burn itself off. The more they danced, the faster they'd be cured. So the city built wooden platforms, hired musicians, cleared public spaces. They institutionalized the dancing, the bureaucracy of madness. The Strasbourg City Council wasn't indifferent. They were, in fact, organized, terrifyingly so. Archival records show they funded this makeshift treatment plan. Payments were made to musicians and carpenters who built stages. At one point, professional dancers were even brought in to encourage the afflicted. Church records note public processions and prayers to saints, particularly Saint Vitus, who was believed to have a hand in curing dance mania. This wasn't chaos. It was structured madness, and like most well-meaning bureaucracy, it likely made things worse. Imagine dancing until your knees buckle, only to be encouraged by city decree to keep going. Imagine being herded onto a stage, your body involuntarily, jerking, your feet soaked with blood, and musicians playing merrily nearby, paid with civic funds to accompany your suffering. How long could you survive in such a world? The heat of July historical climate data, reconstructed from tree rings and soil records, suggests that the summer of 1518 was unusually hot. In a city of tightly packed buildings, poor sanitation, and stagnant water, heat alone could breed illness. Add starvation, stress, and despair, and you have a perfect storm. Food shortages had strained the population. There were rumors of plague in nearby regions. The Rhine had flooded earlier that year, damaging crops. Death felt ever present, and people's bodies were already weakened. And into this maelstrom came the dancers, convulsing, spinning, and collapsing. It's not hard to imagine some dying from simple dehydration, from heat stroke, from exhaustion, or from underlying conditions exacerbated by non-stop motion. But records are frustratingly vague. There are no precise tallies of the dead, no neat ledgers listing names, just scattered accounts. Several died, many succumbed, a terrible madness. History leaves no autopsies. Religion, the original mental health system. It's easy in hindsight to call this a public health failure. But in the 16th century, there was no concept of mental health as we understand it today. Psychological trauma was spiritual weakness, behavioral disorders were sin, and mass delusion, a punishment, often divinely sanctioned. Religious processions were organized to seek divine intervention. Pilgrimages to shrines were arranged. At one point, the afflicted were sent to mass hysteria. A modern name for ancient suffering today, the most accepted theory is this. The dancing plague was an episode of mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria. It often affects groups under extreme psychological stress, especially when belief systems permit or expect physical manifestations of inner turmoil. Symptoms are real: spasms, convulsions, even hallucinations. The cause is psychological, but the effects are physical. And here's what's crucial: the behavior spreads. You might not have had to be mentally ill. You just needed to be scared, tired, overwhelmed. The sight of your neighbor dancing, jerking, foaming, twitching might be enough to trigger something in you, to spark a kind of social mirroring, a psychological chain reaction. This was not so much a disease as a symptom of deep, unrelenting stress, and it was contagious in the way fear is contagious, in the way that hopelessness can take root in a community like mold in damp bread. Could you have resisted that, when the world seemed to be falling apart and your friends were dancing themselves into oblivion? Or would your brain, worn down by hunger and anxiety, follow the only visible script for survival? Not the only case Strasbourg's outbreak is the best documented case of dancing mania, but it was far from the only one. Other episodes occurred across the medieval and early modern world. Aachen, 1374. Hundreds were reported dancing uncontrollably along the Rhine. Some ended up in religious shrines, begging for deliverance. Italy, 15th century, tarantism, a supposed illness caused by the bite of the tarantula, was treated by vigorous dancing, often accompanied by frenzied music. Netherlands, 15th century. Similar outbreaks occurred, often linked to saints' feast days or communal grief. What do they have in common? A belief that the dancing was an affliction and that it required specific, often musical, cures. Each case blurs the line between belief and biology. They speak to a time when the body and soul were not separate domains, but intimately intertwined. A city brought to stillness, by late August, the dancing began to slow. We don't know exactly how it ended. No dramatic decree, no single cure. The platforms were dismantled, the music stopped, and slowly, quietly, the afflicted either recovered or did not. The city returned to its usual miseries: taxes, sermons, seasonal illness. The archive fell silent on the matter. The strange summer passed into rumor, then legend, then dusty history. But for several weeks, one of Europe's great trading cities was paralyzed, not by war or plague or political collapse, but by dance. The end of the summer of 1518, Strasbourg fell silent again. The music faded, the drumming stopped, and the platforms built for the dancers were taken down plank by plank. There was no final proclamation, no civic declaration of triumph or resolution. Only silence and a return to normal, whatever that meant in a city that had for weeks been gripped by invisible forces strong enough to move hundreds of bodies against their will. No monuments were raised, no dates were commemorated. The dancing. Plague simply ended, but that doesn't mean it disappeared. The unmarked graves, it's difficult to quantify how many people died during the outbreak. Some sources claim dozens, others offer vague phrases like many perished. No one kept a precise ledger. Those who collapsed mid-dance likely weren't given heroic funerals. Most were peasants, laborers, women primarily, people who left behind no titles, no property, no heirs to carry their names forward. Their bodies would have been buried quickly, especially in the summer heat. Perhaps in the same graveyards, already burdened by disease and poverty, perhaps without a priest, perhaps without even a marker. And so they vanished from the official record, but they didn't vanish from the memory of the city. or from the deeper story of what happens when societies crack under pressure. Daily life. After the plague. If you were living in Strasbourg that year, the end of the outbreak wouldn't have felt like an epiphany. It would have felt like relief mingled with fatigue. Maybe the music still rang in your ears. Maybe your sister or husband or neighbor had been among the afflicted, and now you return to hauling water, grinding grain, sweating, under coarse linen while the church warned of eternal fires. You might have listened harder to sermons, or started attending Mass more regularly, or sworn to avoid dancing forever, fearing it might return. You wouldn't have told yourself, I lived through a psychogenic event triggered by communal anxiety. You'd have said, God spared me, or I was lucky, or perhaps most honestly, I don't understand what happened. And maybe you didn't want to understand. The modern parallels. The idea of a city-wide psychological breakdown might seem foreign, until you remember how stress behaves. It doesn't always announce itself through screams or violence. Sometimes, fear tiptoes in, disguises itself, takes hold through gestures so familiar you don't notice them at first. Consider how modern crowds behave under stress, how people stampede in panic at a whisper of danger, how conspiracy theories spread in times of economic instability, how entire societies fall into routines, ritualized, compulsive, exhausting, not unlike dancing. And then ask yourself, what would dancing look like today? Would it be a scrolling, thumb on a screen swiping long past the point of exhaustion? Would it be compulsive work, or obsessive exercise, or doom scrolling through news late into the night? The symptoms change. The causes often do not. Survival in the 16th century. Mindset. The Strasbourg authorities, flawed as their methods were, did what they thought was best. They followed the science of their day, mixed with theology, folklore, and communal pressure. And in a way, that blend of partial knowledge and desperation is universal across history. But what does survival look like in that world? You'd need to be more than physically strong. You'd need to be socially aligned, willing to conform to religious and civic expectations. You'd need a sense of emotional resilience, or at least the ability to mask your fear. Would you have spoken out against the music or joined the prayers? Would you have accepted the cure of red shoes and holy relics? Would you have danced or stood by helplessly, pretending not to understand? Survival wasn't about resisting the dance. It was about finding stillness in a city that refused to stop moving. The question of memory. It's worth noting that the dancing plague of 1518 almost slipped out of historical memory. It was kept alive not through official documentation alone, but through chronicles, personal accounts, and eventually 19th and 20th century historians who rediscovered the tale. The event didn't have a name back then. It wasn't called an epidemic. It was something people whispered about, a cautionary tale, a strange chapter in Strasbourg's long, layered story, but it left a scar. Invisible, perhaps, but present. And as you walk through modern Strasbourg, a beautiful, bustling city of medieval alleys and modern cafes, you won't find a plaque to the dancers. You won't find a monument or museum wing dedicated to the victims. You will, however, find the old quarter, the same streets, the same buildings, the same stone foundations where it all happened. Sometimes memory hides just beneath your feet. The mystery that remains, despite centuries of analysis, debate, and research, the true cause of the dancing plague is still unknown. No definitive pathogen, no isolated psychological mechanism, no single historical explanation. It remains a case study in what happens when bodies, minds, and societies all hit their breaking points together. And that mystery, strangely, is part of what gives the event its quiet, haunting power. Not everything in history is fully understood. Some events resist closure. They linger, like a song you can't quite place, or a movement you feel in your legs long after the music has stopped. A final reflection. Why? You wouldn't survive. You may be physically healthy. You may be mentally sound. But the question isn't about you as you are now. It's about you in 1518. You, with no science to explain your symptoms. You, with hunger dulling your thoughts. You, surrounded by fear, by faith, by noise. You, watching as your friends collapse, in convulsions, and being told that the cure is to join them. You wouldn't survive, not because you'd die from dancing, but because you'd become part of it. Because survival in 1518 Strasbourg didn't mean resisting madness. It meant learning to dance with it and knowing when to stop, and very few did. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1858. You're standing on the banks of the River Thames near Westminster, the heart of London's power and politics. The sun is unrelenting, the air hangs thick, and the smell, my God, the smell, is not something you can ignore. It invades your nostrils, your clothes, your very thoughts. It isn't just unpleasant, it's invasive, relentless, living. This is not a metaphor. London is quite literally choking on its own filth. Welcome to the Great Stink. London before. The flush to understand how a global capital came to be overwhelmed by odor, we must begin with what lay beneath, and within it. In the mid-19th century, London was a city swelling with people and industry. Its population had ballooned to over 2 million. Row houses and slums stretched endlessly. And despite this growth, the infrastructure remained largely medieval. Most homes didn't have flushing toilets. Some didn't have any toilet at all. Night soil men still roamed the streets, scooping human waste from cesspits and carting it away in the dark of night, if people could afford to pay. If not, it overflowed. And where did all this human waste end up? The Thames. Always the Thames. The river as sewer. The Thames had long been a lifeline, offering water, transport, and trade. But by 1858, it had become the city's largest open sewer. Decades of dumping, both by households and factories, had turned the river into a thick brown soup of excrement, chemicals, slaughterhouse runoff, and other unmentionables. And the introduction of new modern flush toilets only made the problem worse. The toilets didn't remove waste from the city. They simply moved it faster, and without a functioning sewer system, all of that flushed material ended up right back in the river. It's estimated that in the 1850s, more than 250,000 gallons of raw sewage were entering the Thames every day. The city was quite literally stewing in its own effluent, a stifling summer. But none of this was new. Londoners had endured filth before. What made 1858 different was the weather. That summer was especially hot and dry. The sun beat down mercilessly. Rainfall was minimal. The river's flow slowed, the water level dropped, and as it receded, it exposed layers of waste along the banks, black, viscous, and baking in the sun. The smell, already horrific, became apocalyptic. Newspapers described it in near-biblical terms: sickening, intolerable, utterly pestilential. The stench filled homes, permeated offices, and seeped into the grand halls of Parliament itself. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime. Windows were shuttered. Civil servants vomited at their desks. And the worst part, there was no escape. The stink followed you, clung to you, defined you. Would you have survived that summer? Could you have eaten, slept, worked, or prayed amid a reeking, all-encompassing presence that made even hardened Londoners weep? Medicine's misguided theories. In 1858, the dominant theory of disease was still miasma theory, the belief that bad smells or foul air caused illness. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, All were thought to spread through stink. The more offensive the odor, the more deadly the risk. The actual culprit, of course, was waterborne pathogens like Vibrio cholerae, but germ theory had not yet taken hold. So when the great stink hit, the fear was not just aesthetic. People genuinely believed they were being poisoned, spiritually and physically, by the air itself. It wasn't wrong to be afraid. Cholera had already struck the city in waves, 1832, 1849, 1854, killing thousands. But no one had yet connected it decisively to contaminated drinking water. That is, until a quiet man named Dr. John Snow tried to shift the paradigm. Dr. John Snow and the Broad Street pump just 4 years before the Great Stink. In 1854, Dr. John Snow had identified a contaminated water pump on Broad Street as the source of a deadly cholera outbreak. His method, mapping cases, tracing patterns, was revolutionary. But his ideas linking disease to tainted water rather than bad air were dismissed by many. The establishment clung tightly to miasma. Smell was visible, immediate, tangible. Germs were invisible and thus untrustworthy. And so as the Thames belched up its foul odors in 1858, Parliament didn't consider Snow's findings. They considered the smell. It was odor, not bacteria, that finally drove action. Parliament in panic here is where history tips from ridiculous to surreal. The Houses of Parliament sit on the Thames edge. In 1858, the river's reeking waters lapped directly beneath the legislative chambers. MPs tried everything to continue their work, soaking curtains in lime, hanging sheets soaked in carbolic acid, even considering relocation. The Times reported that a gully hole near the house stank so much that no one could sit in the library. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli called it a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Eventually, the government faced a simple truth. They couldn't govern what they couldn't breathe. And so, for the first time, the whole smell of suffering outweighed centuries of inertia. The call for cleanliness, the great stink, didn't just offend noses, it embarrassed an empire. Here was the capital of the world's most powerful industrial nation, crippled by its inability to handle human waste. It wasn't war or rebellion or economic collapse that brought London to a standstill. It was its own excrement. Finally, in July 1858, Parliament passed legislation to overhaul the city's sewage system. The man tasked with leading this effort was Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer whose name most modern Londoners wouldn't recognize, though they walk atop his legacy every day. His plan: construct massive underground sewers to intercept waste and redirect it away from the Thames. It would be the largest public works project the city had ever seen, but that's a story for the next section. The stink had become unbearable. Parliament, suffocating in its own architectural grandeur, finally moved. But political will alone does not dig tunnels. It doesn't design pumping stations or lay brick by candlelight in wet, disease-ridden mud. That work fell to Joseph Bazalgette, a Chawi man who didn't seek glory, but who quite literally reshaped the underworld of London. His task: to build a sewer system large enough not just to serve the present population, but the London that was coming, swollen by industry, migration, and the unstoppable tide of modern life. His plan was simple, massive, and quietly brilliant. Meet Joseph Bazalgette, the engineer of invisible salvation. Born in 1819, Joseph Bazalgette was a civil engineer trained in canal and railway construction, a practical man, a man of numbers, gradients, and flow rates. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he was perhaps one of the most important Londoners to have ever lived. He worked under the Metropolitan Board of Works, an agency created to modernize the city's infrastructure. When the Great Stink finally pushed Parliament into action, it was Bazalgette who provided not just ideas, but a detailed blueprint. And he had been planning it for years, waiting, measuring, waiting for the smell to speak louder than politics ever could. The plan beneath your feet, Bazalgette's system, would consist of more than 1,300 miles of sewers, large and small, designed to intercept waste before it reached the Thames. Instead of allowing sewage to trickle through open gutters and into the river, the new system would collect it underground and carry it eastward, far from the city centre. At the heart of this project were interceptor sewers, massive tunnels, running parallel to the river, gradually sloping downward to harness gravity. He also designed pumping stations to lift sewage over elevation changes, outfalls to discharge waste downstream. Less than ideal, but far enough to reduce immediate risk, and embankments to conceal these great arteries beneath roads and parks. His most iconic creations? The Victoria Embankment, Albert Embankment, and Chelsea Embankment. Wide promenades Londoners still stroll today, never realizing they are walking atop rivers of engineered salvation. Every brick matters. This was not an age of steel and hydraulics. The tunnels were dug largely by hand. The bricks, millions of them, were laid in precise ovoid shapes to withstand pressure and maximize flow. Bazalgette insisted on quality, uniform dimensions, proper mortar, durable materials, where others might have cut corners. He designed for the future. His tunnels were twice the size he calculated as necessary, accounting for future growth. Critics at the time called it wasteful. But London's population exploded over the next century, and his sewers still function to this day. It's one of the rare times in history when over-engineering was a blessing. You might not notice it, but if you flush a toilet in central London, your waste likely flows through Bazalgette's vision. Labor in the dark let us not forget the human cost. Thousands of laborers, known as navvies, toiled beneath the city for years. They worked by lamplight, knee-deep in mud, often waist-deep in water laced with the very disease they were trying to redirect. Safety was a luxury. Collapse was a constant threat. So was gas buildup, asphyxiation, collapse. They dug and bricked, and blasted their way forward foot by foot, through soil soaked with centuries of waste. You imagine yourself above all this, perhaps a visitor to London's busy streets. But the truth is, survival in that city depended not on avoiding the stench, but on enduring the darkness. Would you have lasted a day underground? The cholera. The areas with the new system, safe. The areas without it, ravaged by disease. It was finally the proof public health advocates needed. And yet, even then, germ theory took time to root. Belief is not easily dislodged, especially when it smells like truth. What it meant to survive in 19th century London survival in that London wasn't just about avoiding cholera or typhoid. It meant tolerating a world that treated human waste as a civic afterthought. It meant drinking water that may have passed through 100 other bodies. It meant trying not to vomit while crossing London Bridge. It meant trusting men like Bazalgette to get it right. If you were poor, you couldn't afford bottled water or physicians. You shared privies, you carried chamber pots. You bathed if you bathed at all, in water drawn from the same river that bore the filth of millions. The city was a machine designed to test your limits. Could you withstand the smell, the squalor, the indignity of living in what was, by all appearances, the filthiest city in Europe? And somehow you did. Or your ancestors did, and they left you a system that still flushes. A forgotten hero, Bazalgette, never became a household name. He died in 1891, knighted, yes, but not lionized. There were no parades, no grand statues. He left behind not a single grand quote, only his work. Underground, unsung, and still functioning more than 150 years later. He didn't build beauty, he built survival. And it's easy to forget survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's dirty. Sometimes it's about showing up with a wheelbarrow and enough bricks to save a city from itself. Would you have honored him, or would you, like most of his contemporaries, walked above his work in silence? The stink is long gone. The streets of London bustle, clean and self-assured. The Thames rolls past the Parliament buildings like it always has, grey, sluggish, dignified. But beneath the surface, both literally and historically, lies the story of a city that was nearly undone, not by war, rebellion, or invasion, but by its own waste. And a man who built a solution so successful, most people forgot it existed at all. This is where we end the story of the Great Stink, not with catastrophe, but with invisibility. The sewer system that still works, Joseph Bazalgette's system, built in the 1860s, was designed to serve a city of 4 million people. London passed that number before World War II, and yet his tunnels are still in use. They've been expanded, reinforced, adapted. But the core of his work, the great intercepting sewers, the pumping stations, the gravity-fed slopes, remain the skeleton of modern London's sanitation. Think of that. Brick tunnels, dug by hand under candlelight, still ferrying away the unmentionables of one of the world's largest cities. If Bazalgette had built merely for his time, London might have collapsed under its own growth. Instead, he overbuilt, quietly, thanklessly. Few public works in history are so enduring and so unrecognized. The danger of forgetting. Here is the great irony of the Great Stink. It forced a city to confront the very thing it most wished to ignore. And then, as soon as the smell faded, London did exactly what societies always do after surviving disaster. It forgot. By the turn of the 20th century, Bazalgette was barely mentioned outside engineering circles. His sewer system became part of the natural order, invisible, taken for granted. That's the problem with success in public health. When it works, it disappears. You notice the sewage system only when it fails, when the drains back up, when the streets flood, when disease returns. Until then, it might as well not exist. But make no mistake, your survival still depends on it. The cost of cleanliness building. The sewer system wasn't cheap. It was funded through new taxes, hotly contested, especially by wealthier landowners who believed the poor should bear more of the cost. London was, after all, a city deeply stratified by class. Clean water, in effect, became a social right, enforced by engineering rather than politics. Bazalgette's work showed something crucial. Sanitation isn't about aesthetics, it's about equality. Rich and poor alike flush into the same system. Everyone breathes the same air. Everyone benefits or suffers based on the strength of shared infrastructure. In a way, the Great Stink forced a moral reckoning. Either London would build for everyone or collapse for everyone. And for once, it chose to build. Modern parallels. The world today faces sanitation challenges just as daunting. Over 2 billion people still lack access to safe sewage systems. Disease spreads not because we lack the knowledge to stop it, but because infrastructure is invisible until it's not. The Great Stink is a warning. Problems ignored become unignorable. So ask yourself, what modern stinks do we tolerate? Because the alternative feels too expensive, too complicated, too political. What filth, literal or metaphorical, are we still swimming in? Bazalgette's legacy in the digital age, in a city obsessed with monuments, stone lions, bronze generals, glass skyscrapers, Bazalgette's greatest legacy is entirely underground. He is the ghost engineer, the patron saint of plumbing, the man whose greatest achievement was making the worst parts of human life quietly disappear. And perhaps that's why we forget him. His work wasn't dramatic. It didn't soar. It flowed, through tunnels, through valves, through brick laid by anonymous hands, in mud that no one wants to remember. Would you have survived the stink? Or would you have been one of the many who only noticed the problem once it reached their nose? More importantly, would you have remembered the man who fixed it? The final transformation. The Thames today is cleaner than it has been in centuries. Fish have returned. Rowers train on its surface. Bridges span it without offending the nose. Tourists line its banks, sipping coffee and taking photos, blissfully unaware of the river's fetid history. And that's the point. The Great Stink didn't just birth a sewage system. It transformed a river. It redefined what a city owes its sea. People. It showed, in perhaps the dullest and most vital way possible, that progress is not built on battles but on bricks, on pipes, on pumps, on the invisible choices we make to prevent suffering before it starts. You wouldn't last long in 1858, not because you're soft, but because you've forgotten what life was like before the flush. You likely think of salt as something trivial, scattered, over dinner, spilled on a counter, poured into a bath. But in pre-revolutionary France, salt was something else entirely. It was obligation, it was punishment, it was rebellion in crystal form. This is the story of the gabelle, a tax so petty, so boring, so universally resented that it helped ignite one of the most world-changing uprisings in modern history, the French Revolution. And yes, it was over salt. Salt before refrigeration. To understand why salt mattered, you have to strip away the modern world. Before refrigeration, salt was survival. It preserved food, meat, fish, even cheese. It cured hides and tanned leather. It was used in medicine, in dyeing cloth, in maintaining livestock. Without salt, whole regions risked starvation in winter. And it wasn't just a culinary necessity. It was a symbol of endurance, a store of value. Entire trade routes were built around it, from the Sahara to the Alps. In France, it was as necessary as air, and that made it easy to exploit. The gabelle, a tax designed to breed hatred. The gabelle was a salt tax imposed by the French monarchy. First introduced in the 14th century to fund wars, it was kept and expanded long after those wars ended. By the 18th century, it was deeply entrenched in the machinery of the Ancien Régime. But it wasn't just a flat tax. That would have been too fair. Instead, France was divided into 6 salt tax regions, each with its own rules, rates, and levels of enforcement. In some regions, salt was taxed heavily. In others, less so. In a few, it was nearly tax-free. This patchwork of salt zones meant that your geography dictated your burden. Living a few miles in the wrong direction could double your salt bill. But the gabelle went even further. Mandatory. Purchases, mandatory resentment. In many areas, citizens were forced by law to buy a certain amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. This was called the sel obligatoire, the obligatory salt quota. You couldn't refuse, you couldn't sell it back. You had to buy it from the king's official salt store at a price set by the crown. It was a form of economic conscription. You were drafted into taxation whether or not you had use for what you were buying. And the penalties for breaking the rules were severe. Caught using untaxed salt, fined. Caught selling salt privately, imprisoned. Caught smuggling salt across zone borders, jailed, sometimes worse. The smugglers. Salt is rebellion, and yet, smuggle they did. The French countryside in the 1700s was crisscrossed by secret trails and hidden paths used by faux sauniers, illegal salt traders. These men and women risked everything to carry untaxed salt from low-tax regions into high-tax areas. Some did it for profit, others out of principle. Many simply had no choice. The salt smugglers became folk heroes in some regions. Songs were written about them. Stories were passed down. They were thieves, yes, but thieves against an unjust system. And behind them always came the gendarmes, the salt police. Yes, there was an entire force dedicated to catching salt smugglers. Nearly 3,000 agents patrolled the countryside, more concerned with barrels of brine than with violent crime. Salt was, quite literally, criminalized. The gabelle and the common people. If you lived in France under the Ancien Régime, your life was already hard. You paid the tile, land tax, the capitation, head tax, and countless local fees. You owed forced labor to the state. You tithed to the church, and then came the gabelle. It wasn't just the cost, it was the humiliation. Being forced to buy something you might not need, being watched by tax officials, having your wagon searched, your barrels inspected, your kitchen probed. Salt, the most basic of necessities, was transformed into a symbol of arbitrary state power, and symbols are Dangerous who didn't pay. The great insult wasn't just that salt was taxed, it was who didn't pay. The nobility were often exempt, so were clergy. The very people with the most wealth and land bore the lightest burden, and they often lived in regions with lower salt rates by royal convenience. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. The gabelle became a perfect storm of injustice, a universal need taxed unevenly, enforced cruelly, and benefiting the least needy. Sound familiar? Whispers of revolution. By the late 1700s, France was teetering, years of bad harvests, mounting debt, a bloated aristocracy, a distant, opulent monarchy, and everywhere salt, regulated, restricted, resented. When the Estates General was called in 1789, lists of grievances from across France poured into Paris. Known as the Cahiers de Doléances, these documents offer a rare glimpse into the minds of everyday people. The gabelle appeared again and again, and not war, not even bread, salt, because salt touched every family, every table, every wound. The cost of breaking the rules. To fully grasp the bitterness surrounding the gabelle, consider this. In the 1760s, a man named Pierre Gaillot was arrested for smuggling salt. He had no previous crimes. He was poor, his children were hungry. He was caught with 2 sacks of untaxed salt, worth perhaps a few sous. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His family lost their home. He was one of thousands. The prison system under the gabelle grew so overcrowded that entire facilities were built just to house salt smugglers. Records show families broken, children orphaned, lives upended, because of a tax on something that came from the sea. How long could you have lived under that kind of pressure? Would you have followed the rules, or would you have taken to the forest trails with a sack of salt slung across your shoulder? By 1789, the Kingdom of France had begun to unravel. Its finances were in ruin. Its king, Louis XVI, had lost the confidence of his subjects. Food was scarce, incomes were collapsing. But amid the whirlwind of crises, economic, political, spiritual, there was one injustice that almost every citizen could agree on. The gabelle had to go. The writing on the walls, the complaints against the gabelle weren't whispered in taverns anymore. They were written in the Cahiers de Doléances, the official grievance ledgers submitted to the Estates General. Across all regions, from Normandy to the Languedoc, ordinary French citizens listed the salt tax as one of their top concerns. In some towns, the gabelle was mentioned even before hunger or land inequality. Why? Because salt was personal. You could survive without land. You could even survive a few missed meals. But salt touched your food, your preservation, your health. You needed it daily, and you resented being forced to buy it from the king. You especially resented being told how much to buy. The tipping point in June 1789, the Third Estate, the common people's representatives, broke away from the Estates General and declared themselves the National Assembly. Within weeks, the storming of the Bastille became the spark that ignited full-scale revolution. At first glance, the gabelle seems a small concern beside liberty, equality, and fraternity. But that's the point. It was a small concern. And yet, it made people angrier than many larger ones. The salt tax, in all its bureaucratic cruelty, represented the everyday tyranny of the Ancien Regime. Not abstract injustice, but lived injustice. The kind that made a poor man's dinner more expensive than a nobleman's banquet. The kind that imprisoned widows and fined fishermen. The kind that made mothers ration salt for cooking, cleaning, and preservation, while priests salted their meat with impunity. Collapse of the system. In the chaos of 1789 to 1790, the gabelle began to fall apart, not by decree but by defiance. Salt smuggling exploded. Salt warehouses were looted. In some provinces, the grenier à sel, state-run salt depots, were destroyed by angry mobs. Prisoners convicted of salt offenses were released. Judges stopped enforcing gabelle laws. By 1790, the National Assembly officially abolished the gabelle, but enforcement had already collapsed. The people had, in effect, ended the tax before the state did. Abolition and aftermath. The fall of the gabelle was met with celebration in rural France. In cities and towns where people had long relied on smugglers and secret trails, public bonfires were lit. Salt was passed around and shared freely, almost ritualistically. It was one of the earliest and most symbolic victories of the French Revolution. And yet, abolition did not bring instant justice. Salt remained scarce in some areas. New local taxes were introduced. Infrastructure to distribute salt fairly was lacking. The wounds left by the gabelle lingered, but for many, its end marked the first time the state had been forced to listen, and that mattered more than the salt itself, the cost of rebellion. In the years that followed, France would descend into the reign of terror, foreign wars, and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. But those who had fought against the gabelle carried their bitterness with them. One smuggler, Jean Doucet, who had been imprisoned for 5 years for carrying illegal salt, later became a delegate in the local Revolutionary Council. He spoke publicly against unequal taxation and for the redistribution of churchland. He had no formal education, he had no family wealth, he had salt scars, and that made him credible. This was the quiet revolution within the revolution, the slow elevation of people whose only political act had once been to carry salt in the night, the return of the gabelle, and then in 1806 it returned. Under Napoleon, the gabelle was reinstated, not as an act of oppression, but out of fiscal necessity. The empire needed funds. Wars had to be financed, bureaucracies had to be paid, and salt was still a universal commodity. The people groaned, but they paid. Napoleon's regime, unlike the Bourbons before him, maintained a complex social contract. In return for taxes, citizens received education, conscription pay, and centralized governance. The gabelle, though hated, became tolerated again, but it never fully lost its sting. Living under the gabelle, a thought experiment, if you had lived in 1788. France, here's what your salt experience might have looked like. You would be required to buy about 7 kilograms of salt per adult annually. You'd pay up to 10 times the market rate in a high-tax region. You could not use this salt for curing meats. That required a separate, even more expensive kind. If caught trading untaxed salt, you could be fined or imprisoned, even on a first offense. Your neighbors could report you for evasion, and they often did. Now imagine raising a family under those rules. Feeding animals, preserving food for winter. Imagine the sting of every forced purchase, every search, every sack inspected by a state officer. Salt would never taste the same. A tax's legacy. The gabelle was finally abolished for good in 1946, long after kings and emperors had come and gone. It had survived the revolution, Napoleon, 2 monarchies, and the rise of the Republic. But its spirit, its injustice, was absorbed into France's national memory. Today, gabelle is a byword for unfair taxation. It lives on in textbooks, in political speeches, in the quiet reminder that small daily injustices can lead to unthinkable change. A salt tax, not a battlefield, not a throne, not a treaty. A salt tax helped bring down one of the oldest monarchies in Europe. It's almost too quiet to notice, and that's exactly the point. The gabelle was not grand. It was not violent at first. It was part of the wallpaper of everyday life. But like a dripping faucet or a stone in your shoe, it wore people down. and in doing so it revealed just how fragile the ancien regime truly was. In this final section, we examine how a tax on salt, of all things, came to represent a dying system's arrogance, and how its memory shaped the revolutions and republics that followed. The anatomy of an unraveling by the late 1780s, the French monarchy was hemorrhaging legitimacy. Louis XVI was seen not as a tyrant, but worse, as incompetent. He taxed the poor borrowed from the rich, and avoided the hard reforms that might have saved his crown. The nobility refused to pay their share. The clergy clung to privilege, and meanwhile the peasants paid for it all with coin, labor, and daily humiliation. The gabelle was never just about salt. It was about being told, by someone who had never plowed a field or cured a ham, that you must buy something at an unfair price or face punishment. It was about watching smugglers become heroes and tax officials become villains. It was about seeing justice inverted in plain sight. It was about a monarchy that ruled without understanding, and a people who could no longer pretend not to see. Here the final tipping point. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was not a direct response to the gabelle, but it was an explosion of long simmering fury, some of which had been stoked by taxes like it. Even after the prison was stormed and the king was forced to accept the National Assembly, salt remained a focal point. The abolition of the gabelle in March 1790 was one of the Assembly's earliest and most popular acts. It wasn't debated endlessly like property rights or political theory. It was simple, immediate, necessary. In many ways, abolishing the gabelle was the first true blow to feudal logic. It said, this isn't just about kings and parliaments. It's about how we live, how we eat, how we survive. And that made it revolutionary. Revolution interrupted. But revolutions are never clean. The French Revolution quickly splintered. First came the constitutional monarchy, then the First Republic, then the Reign of Terror, then the Directory, then Napoleon. Each regime promised something better. Each redefined the people, and each made its own compromises. When Napoleon reinstated the gabelle in 1806, it wasn't met with immediate revolt. Why? Because the system around it had changed. The tax was still unfair, but it was now seen as part of the price of national stability. People grumbled, but they paid, and thus salt lost its power to provoke, at least for a time. How you would. Have lived, imagine yourself living in France in the early 19th century. The revolution has come and gone. You are a small farmer, or perhaps a baker. The gabelle has returned quietly. You remember the old days, the trails in the woods, the men who vanished for carrying too much salt, the quotas, the threats, the fear. And now it's back, less harsh but still there. Would you protest, or would you shrug and say, better this than chaos? That's the weight of history. Even victory can turn into compromise. Salt as memory over time. The gabelle faded from daily life. It persisted in form but lost its fire. When it was abolished for the final time in 1946, it was more historical curiosity than active outrage. But the memory of the gabelle, its unfairness, its symbolism, endured. In textbooks, it became shorthand for all that was wrong with the ancien regime. In speeches, it served as a cautionary tale. In the collective imagination, it was proof that even the smallest injustices matter when repeated enough times and inflicted upon enough people. The modern echo today, the word gabelle, still occasionally appears in French politics, not as a literal tax, but as a metaphor for unjust burdens quietly imposed. You see it when citizens protest fuel taxes that disproportionately affect rural drivers, when debates emerge over VAT and consumption tax, when people ask why they're paying more for the basics, while the wealthy seem untouched. It's the salt question all over again. Who pays for what and why? What the gabelle taught the world, the salt tax didn't cause the French Revolution. But it was the grain of sand in the shoe that reminded every peasant, baker, and fisherman that something was wrong. And when enough people feel something is wrong, change becomes possible. The gabelle taught us that revolutions don't always start with manifestos. Sometimes they start with recipes that taste different. with kitchens that run out of salt, with children who cough because the meat has spoiled, with laws that make no sense to those who must follow them. Final reflection. Would you have noticed the salt? Would you have questioned the gable? Would you have smuggled salt, paid the price in silence, complained to your neighbors but complied with the law? Or would you have understood, as many finally did, that sometimes the most boring injustices are the most dangerous ones because they pile up, quietly, grain by grain, until someone says, enough. It is June 1816. In New England, frost bites the fields at dawn. In Ireland, hail falls in midsummer. In China, crops yellow in cold winds. And in Europe, rivers overflow not from spring melt, but from perpetual rain. There is no summer this year, and no explanation that people of the time can agree on. The birds are quiet, the skies are grey, the food is running out. You may think you could survive it. But as the months go by, you learn quickly. When the sky stops working, so does everything else. This is the story of the year without a summer, an event as slow-moving as it was catastrophic, and one that began half a world away, with a mountain that tore itself apart, the explosion that changed the world. The story doesn't start in Europe or America. It starts in the Dutch East Indies, on the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora exploded. It was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, 4 times the power of Krakatoa. A blast so loud, it was heard over 200 miles away. Entire villages vanished in pyroclastic flows. The top third of the mountain was simply gone. Tens of thousands died locally, but the true death toll, slow, dispersed, and often uncounted, was yet to come. The global veil, the Tambora eruption, ejected an estimated 100 cubic kilometers of ash and debris into the atmosphere. More importantly, it sent millions of tons of sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. There, the particles formed a reflective aerosol layer, a volcanic veil that circled the globe. It dimmed sunlight, altered jet streams, dropped global temperatures by an average of 1 to 2 degrees C. That may sound trivial. It wasn't. Crops rely on narrow temperature ranges. A single cold week can ruin a harvest. An entire cold season, it can end lives. And in 1816, it wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a global agricultural collapse. Dark days in Europe, across Europe, the weather turned uncanny. In France and Germany, the summer months were bitterly cold and sodden. June brought snow in Hungary. Switzerland recorded frost in July. Torrential rain followed, flooding fields and rotting seeds before they could germinate. In England, the wheat harvest failed. Potatoes, the fallback crop, rotted in the ground. Grain prices doubled, then tripled. Bread riots broke out in rural towns. Farmers slaughtered livestock early to save on feed, causing meat prices to crash, then vanish. In cities, markets emptied. Starvation crept in, not with drama, but with quiet absence. There was simply nothing to eat. Ireland and the edge of famine Ireland had long lived on the brink. In 1816, it toppled over. The cold and rain decimated. Oats and barley, potatoes, the peasant staple, succumbed to waterlogging and rot. In some regions, 2/3 of the crop failed. Tens of thousands were plunged into hunger. Starvation led to weakened immune systems. Disease spread, typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery. But the state response was sluggish. The British government feared dependence, or worse, rebellion. Aid came slowly and in the form of public works. Break rocks for your ration, dig ditches for a crust of bread. You might imagine yourself surviving such a time, but would you last long digging drainage? Channels half-fed in the rain under threat of eviction. Across the Atlantic, America feels the cold even. The young United States wasn't spared. In New England, snow fell in June. Farmers woke to frozen furrows and dead seedlings. Frosts returned in July and August. Corn, a vital staple, failed completely. In many areas, some towns gave up planting entirely. Prices soared. Families abandoned their land and migrated west toward the Ohio River Valley, hoping for a kinder climate. They found uncertainty instead. This westward push would echo for decades, shaping American demographics in ways historians still trace today. When cold creates culture, not all consequences were tragic. Some were cultural. In Geneva, during a particularly miserable summer retreat, a group of English travelers, trapped indoors by perpetual rain, amused themselves with ghost stories. One of them, Mary Shelley, began scribbling notes for what would become Frankenstein. Her husband, Percy Bysshe, Shelley and Lord Byron also wrote dark, brooding poetry during those same stormy days. The gloomy skies and perpetual dusk birthed a new literary mood. Gothic romanticism. Misery, it seems, can be creatively fertile, but that's little comfort if you were hungry. A crisis of explanations in 1816, people didn't know about Tambora. The eruption was God's anger was a popular one. Others blamed sunspots or an imbalance of humors in the earth. In Germany, rumors of artificial weather manipulation spread, a forerunner to modern conspiracy theories. Science wouldn't understand the link between volcanic eruptions and climate for another 60 years. Until then, all people had were the symptoms and fear. Surviving the year without a summer. To survive 1816, you needed more than endurance. You needed a store of old grain or cured meat, warm clothing you couldn't afford, access to forest or forage, a landlord willing to wait, a body resistant to disease, a community willing to share. In rural France, families cooked grass and leaves into thin soups. In Switzerland, desperate villagers ate cats and dogs. In China, where monsoon rains failed, famine gripped Yunnan province, killing tens of thousands. Everywhere the same cycle repeated: crop failure, hunger, disease, death, migration, and always the cold. The unrelenting, unexplained cold. There's a specific kind of hunger that doesn't announce itself with groans. It tightens your skin. It slows your feet. It fogs your thinking. You don't scream. You endure. In 1816, millions of people endured. Not a famine of fire, but one of absence. A summer that never arrived. A harvest that never ripened. A world that seemed to have forgotten how to feed itself. The worst part? It didn't go away. Not in autumn, not in winter. The aftermath of Tambora's eruption would echo for 3 years. But the second half of 1816 was when things fell apart. A rain that wouldn't stop. Throughout Europe, rain continued into July, then August, then September. Rivers swelled, floodplains drowned, hay rotted in the fields. Without hay, livestock died. Without livestock, milk and meat vanished. Without grain, bread disappeared or became unaffordable. The rich tightened their larders. The poor stood in lines or in riotous crowds. In Germany, bakeries were stormed. A town in Saxony reported a bread riot led by women who overturned carts and forced open locked storehouses. Not for gold, not for protest, just for food. In France, hungry peasants attacked grain convoys. In England, mob dinners became common. Gatherings of the poor who would march to a wealthy estate and demand soup. It was not revolution, it was regression. A reversion to a time when food scarcity wasn't rare. It was normal. Disease comes. On hungry feet hunger is a disease of the gut, but it also opens the door to others. In the wet chill of 1816-1817, epidemics spread rapidly through weakened populations. The most feared was typhus, often misdiagnosed, always feared. It spreads through lice and thrives in overcrowded, unhygienic conditions that exploded as people fled, failed farms for towns and cities. In Ireland, a dual outbreak of famine and fever killed tens of thousands. In Scotland, entire villages lost half their population. In Switzerland, deaths from dysentery and malnutrition outpaced births. In cities, the problem multiplied. Grain shipments were hoarded, then looted. Landlords demanded rent in food. Charities were overwhelmed, and the dead were often buried without ceremony. Just another number in a ledger, if that. Migration. Walking toward hope, for many there was no survival, only escape. In the United States, 1816 and the following 2 years saw a massive wave of migration westward. Farmers abandoned the frost-bitten hills of Vermont and New Hampshire, headed toward Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. In Europe, emigration to the Americas increased. Families sold land at a loss or simply walked away. Some left in secret, hoping to find distant relatives or rumored jobs in coastal cities. Migration records show surges in movement even within countries, rural to urban, valley to hill, north to south. People didn't just follow the sun. They chased memory, looking for places where summer had once lived, children of the cold one of the cruelties of the year. Without a summer was its effect on children, not just in 1816, but in the years to come. Chronic malnutrition in utero and early childhood left many with stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and reduced cognitive development. These children would go on to live adult lives, but with bodies shaped by absence. In poor regions of France and Italy, birth rates dropped sharply, not from infertility, but from deliberate postponement. Couples waited or gave up. Infants were abandoned more often, and wet nurses were overwhelmed. This wasn't war, it wasn't conquest, but it was a disaster measured in generations. The government response, patchy, and political governments responded, but unevenly. In the United Kingdom, aid came through public works and charitable grain sales, but critics noted that relief was too little, too late. The Irish suffered worst as usual, viewed by many in London as distant and suspect. In France, the government tried to stabilize bread prices and encourage communal ovens. In the German states, rulers opened granaries, but with suspicion, fearing that handouts might breed unrest. In Austria, Emperor Francis I ordered food relief but simultaneously censored newspapers to prevent panic. People died, but were not allowed to talk about it, and no one, not a single European government, understood the cause of the cold. Scientific darkness Tambora's eruption wasn't linked to the strange weather until decades later. At the time, science had no framework for connecting atmospheric sulfur with global climate. Meteorology was in its infancy. Volcanology didn't exist as a formal science, and so the most catastrophic climate anomaly of the century unfolded, without explanation. That ignorance bred other explanations. Religious sermons declared it divine punishment. Farmers blamed local aristocrats. Superstitions revived in some regions, including old fears of witches and weather magic. In the absence of knowledge, people sought meaning, and meaning in hard times often turns on itself. How you might have lived and died. If you lived in 1816 and were not wealthy, here's what your survival might have hinged on. A cellar with preserved food from the previous year, a goat or small flock of chickens for protein neighbors willing to trade or share. A body that could handle hard labor with half rations. The emotional resilience to watch loved ones waste away. You might have made thin gruel from tree bark and flour. You might have eaten boiled grass. You might have buried your child in wet soil while the cold rain came down in August. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't gothic, it was slow, cruel attrition. The poor records of the poor today, we have only scattered. Data on the true death toll of the year without a summer. Historians estimate 200,000 deaths globally, but the real number may be much higher. The poor leave behind few records. Their deaths weren't always counted, and their stories weren't always told. But they lived and died in vast numbers, quietly, away from the books and the presses and the salons of Europe's elite. History often preserves noise, but 1816 was a disaster of silence. By the end of 1816, the world hadn't ended, but for many it felt like it had. Crops had failed, families had starved, thousands had buried loved ones and left ancestral homes. It wasn't the kind of disaster that comes with fire and banners. It came quietly by degrees, and when it left, it took memory with it. The year without a summer didn't rewrite the map like a war. It didn't crown new kings, but it reshaped something more enduring. How people thought about weather, food, migration, and the planet itself. And as the calendar turned to 1817, the question remained, how do you recover from a year that broke everything? Recovery without answers. The rains slowed in early 1817. Temperatures began to normalize. Fields that had been mud pits hardened into workable soil again. Farmers cautiously replanted. grain, potatoes, oats. But the memory of failure haunted every swing of the scythe. Many lacked seed grain. Many more lacked animals to pull plows. In Ireland, for example, over 200,000 head of cattle had been slaughtered for lack of fodder. That livestock wasn't coming back overnight. The poor who had relied on charity or soup kitchens now found those sources drying up. Governments declared the emergency over. But for many, recovery meant starting from zero. With worse health, fewer resources and colder homes, you wouldn't have called it a return to normal, you would have called it less bad. Migration, memory, and the myth of better lands in North America, the legacy of the cold summer lived on in westward migration. Families who left New England in 1816 didn't return. They settled in Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, clearing forest, planting corn in unfamiliar soil. Some never spoke of the summer again. Others turned it into family legend. The year the sun forgot us. The year father walked to Ohio barefoot. The year the frost came in July. These stories became part of American folklore. In some rural regions, 1800 and froze to death became a shorthand for suffering and perseverance. And in Europe, memories of hunger didn't die. They shaped future political unrest. The trauma of 1816-1817 left people more skeptical of elites, more vocal in their complaints, and more prepared to demand relief during future food crises, especially in the decades leading to 1848, the scientific revelation. Too late for them. It wasn't until the 1880s that scientists began to connect the dots. Stratospheric aerosols, volcanic eruptions. But the people of 1816 never knew why the cold came. They died with the mystery unsolved. The Little Ice Age and what Tambora tapped into Tambora didn't start the cooling trend. It exacerbated it. From roughly the 14th to mid-19th century, the world experienced a Little Ice Age, a period of cooler than average temperatures, especially in Europe and North America. Tambora supercharged this trend. It was like throwing a heavy stone into a slowly freezing pond. The ripples reached everywhere, and yet climate was still seen as fixed. The idea that humans or even volcanoes could alter the climate on a global scale was radical, even terrifying. Would you have wanted to believe such a thing in 1816? That the sky itself could be broken? Art, literature, and a mood of melancholy. The cultural effects of the year without a summer are subtle but significant. Darkened skies, shorter days, and persistent gloom contributed to a rising romantic melancholy. Literature and painting turned more inward, more brooding. We already saw how Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was born in a rain-soaked villa during the miserable Swiss summer. But the tone of Gothic fiction, the landscapes of Turner, and even Byron's poetry reflect a world newly aware of nature's wrath. Art became a way to make sense of something senseless. How you might remember it. If you had lived through 1816, your memories might not focus on the weather itself. You might remember a birthday when no fruit ripened, a winter coat worn in August, a neighbor lost to fever, a wedding cancelled for want of bread, a funeral in muddy snow, the silence in the fields when there should have been songbirds. These are the markers of trauma not written in history. Books. These are the memories that don't survive in ledgers, but live in lullabies, curses, and handed-down stories. The slow return of trust in the seasons. By 1819, the climate had stabilized, crops returned, trade resumed, food became ordinary again. But trust did not. Many who lived through the year without a summer never fully believed in the reliability of nature again. They planted extra, stored more, emigrated sooner, prayed harder, feared deeper. Because once the sun disappears, for a season, it never quite shines the same way again. The unnoticed warning. What makes the year without a summer so chilling is not just the death or the frost, but how quiet it was. No armies moved, no buildings fell, no empire collapsed. And yet millions were affected. Lives were shortened, families scattered, systems strained. It reminds us that not all disasters roar. Some arrive gently, like a cool wind in May. And by the time we realize something is wrong, it is already too late. Final reflection. Could it happen again? Today we know a similar eruption could have global effects. Tambora was massive, but not unique. Modern society depends on stable growing seasons, reliable distribution chains, predictable weather. What would a year without a summer look like? Now, empty grocery shelves, failed global supply chains, mass migration, a breakdown of climate trust. The science is better now, but human systems are still fragile, still stretched thin, still vulnerable. And that leaves us with a final, uneasy thought. You might not survive the next year without a summer either. Not because the world would end, but because everything you depend on would pause. Imagine waking in a small, slanted room under a thatched roof. The ceiling is low enough that you can touch it without stretching. The walls groan as they settle, wood warped from years of damp winters and smoky summers. The air smells of smoke, unwashed fabric, tallow, and something worse, something sharp and acidic, lurking beneath it all. It is morning in your Tudor townhouse, and the day begins not with coffee but with urine. Welcome to 16th century England, where life was hard, noisy, close, and above all smelly, and above. Not because people were lazy, but because cleanliness, comfort, and privacy were luxuries you'd never think to expect. A house built to lean Tudor townhouses are iconic today. Black timber beams, whitewashed wattle and daub walls, sharply pitched roofs and charming upper stories that jut out over the street. They appear quaint in modern tourist towns, but inside, they were cramped, dark, and perpetually smoky. Timber construction was fast and cheap, but also porous and flammable. Rooms were small and shared. Glass windows were a sign of wealth. Most had animal horn or oiled cloth to let in light. That light was precious. Candles were expensive, and sunlight rarely reached the lower floors. And yes, the upper stories leaned. Not for charm, but because of a design called jettying, a practical way to gain space above without taking up more street width. It also kept rainwater away from the walls to prevent rot, but it made homes creak, shift, and lean toward each other like tired neighbors. The hearth and the smoke. The center of the home was the hearth, a fire burning almost constantly, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook. But most homes lacked a chimney. Instead, smoke drifted upward through a hole in the ceiling, or just filled the room. You breathed it, your clothes absorbed it, the walls darkened with it. Long-term exposure to wood smoke caused chronic respiratory issues, but there was no alternative. Hair was smoky indoors and often fouled outdoors. In fact, many Tudor homes were blacker on the inside than the outside. Sleep, shared, and segmented beds were not private, not really. A large household might sleep several to a room, even several to a bed. The wealthy had 4 posters with curtains, more for warmth than modesty. Servants often slept in hallways, near doors, or on pallets in the kitchen. Children slept where they could be watched or hidden. Sleep was segmented. People often went to bed shortly after sunset, then woke around midnight for an hour or 2 before sleeping again. This first and second sleep was common before artificial lighting made consolidated rest possible. During that midnight waking, people might tend the fire, pray, urinate, or even visit neighbors. It was a dim, half-dreaming period of life that we no longer experience. Would you find peace in such a rhythm, or would the constant closeness wear you down? The chamber pot problem. Let's address the reality directly. There was no indoor plumbing. At night or in bad weather, urination happened in a chamber pot, usually kept under the bed or beside the hearth. In the morning, it was emptied into the street. Often without warning, gardez-vous was the customary cry in cities like Edinburgh, an anglicisation of regardez-l'eau, watch out for the water. It was a warning, as human waste splashed from second-story windows to the gutters below. The smell of a Tudor street was not a seasonal nuisance. It was a defining feature of urban life. Mixed with that odor, the grease of butchered animals, the stench of horse droppings, the rot of uneaten market vegetables, and the ever-present stink of unwashed humans. Personal hygiene, or the lack of it, is not true that Tudors never bathed. But soap was rare, and water was risky. Bathing involved hauling buckets from wells or rivers. both often contaminated, and heating them over a fire. A full-body wash was an ordeal. Most people dry cleaned themselves, scraping with cloth, using scented herbs or vinegar rubs. Washing the hands and face was common, especially before meals. But soaking in a tub was a luxury, and often seen as risky, since opening the pores was believed to let in disease. Lice were ubiquitous, fleas more so. Clothing was infested, not just dirty. Special tools, knit combs and louse pokers, were used regularly. People slept in their clothes. Undergarments were changed once a week. If you were fastidious, would you last long before the crawling and itching drove you mad? The kitchen. That wasn't many Tudor homes didn't have a true kitchen. Cooking happened over the hearth, in pots. Suspended by chains or in baking ovens built into the fireplace wall. Food was seasonal, preserved or salted. Fresh meat was rare unless you were rich. More often you ate pottage, a thick stew of grains and root vegetables. Bread, coarse, dark and made from rye or barley. Ale, safer than water. Cheese, onions, pickled things. The diet was heavy, repetitive and hard on the gut. Scurvy, rickets and tooth loss were common. Sugar was for the rich, honey for the lucky. Still hungry? Noise, neighbors and no privacy. A Tudor townhouse was not a quiet place. Houses were packed close together. Streets echoed with vendors, carts, shouting apprentices and barking dogs. Thin walls did little to muffle arguments, births, deaths, or illness. If your neighbor had a cough, you heard it. If they died, you smelled it. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. The very concept of personal space was different. People lived communally, worked communally, suffered communally. You were never alone. Not really. Not even in your thoughts. The dull, dangerous. Everyday life in a Tudor townhouse was defined by chores, fetching water, tending fires, hauling food, cleaning chamber pots, mending clothing, feeding livestock, avoiding infection, dousing sparks, chopping wood, stirring pottage, scraping plates, emptying ash, chasing vermin. It was a life of tasks, and each task carried risk, burns, cuts, infections. A stubbed toe might turn gangrenous, a cooking accident could disfigure. A bad childbirth, a toothache, a fever, each a sentence of suffering. Yet most people simply did what had to be done, because there was no other way. You wake to darkness, not the darkness of sleep, but of smoke. The hearth embers are cold. The air tastes like soot. Somewhere above, pigeons coo from the eaves. Below, someone coughs, wet, persistent, and familiar. A child stirs. A rat scuttles behind the wainscoting. It is morning again, and life in your Tudor townhouse resumes with no comfort, no privacy, and no real silence. But this is not a story of misery. It is a story of endurance, because despite the filth, the smell and the closeness, Tudor households worked. They functioned. And for most, that was enough. Fire, friend, and constant threat. The hearth was everything. It cooked, it heated, it lit, but it also smoked, sparked, and sometimes destroyed. Tudor towns lived in fear of fire. Most buildings were made of timber, wattle and daub, and thatch, all flammable. Chimneys were rare or crude. Candles were unstable. Open flames burned all day, and yet people accepted the risk. Fires were part of life. You monitored the embers, banked the coals, and prayed nothing caught. When fire did break out, there were no fire brigades. Neighbors formed a bucket line. Sometimes the best defense was tearing down nearby homes to prevent spread. One blaze could consume half a town, and when winter came, you risked it again, because cold killed faster than fire. Toilet troubles, streets. As sewers, we've covered chamber pots. But what happened after the pot? Waste was often flung into the gutter or dumped into cesspits, holes dug near or beneath homes. These pits were occasionally emptied by night soil men who worked after dark. With buckets and shovels, their work was vital and reviled. The stench, unspeakable, the danger, constant. Methane pockets sometimes exploded. More than one night soil man suffocated in the very waste he was hired to move. For most, the solution was simpler: throw it in the street. Tudor towns had open gutters running alongside the roads. Rain carried waste away eventually. Until then, it baked in the sun or froze in the cold. Would you survive walking down such a street in summer? Would your appetite? The smells that never left. Let's be blunt. Tudor life smelled bad. Your home stank of smoke, grease, and sweat. Your bedding was rarely washed. Your skin carried the scent of last week's labor. Your neighbors were the same. Perfume was expensive. Clean linen, rarer still. But people didn't complain. Smell wasn't just tolerated, it was normalized. The human nose adjusts quickly. The rot of the street, the sweat of the body, the oily tang of tallow, the acrid sting of vinegar washings. To the Tudor nose, you might smell strange, soaped, perfumed, sterile, artificial. Comfort was relative, and most people didn't expect it. Work in the house, work outside it. The Tudor townhouse was not just a home, it was often a workplace. If you were a weaver, your loom stood near the hearth. If a tanner, you stored hides in the back room. If a baker, your oven was your shop. If a midwife, your patients came to your door. Children were born in the same rooms where bread was baked and goats were butchered. Work, life, illness, and death all happened under the same sagging beams. There was no line between domestic and economic space. The very idea of work-life balance would have been laughable, and yet homes functioned like small factories, loud, lively, and necessary. Household hierarchy: who slept? Where inside the house, space was everything, and it was assigned strictly. The patriarch and matriarch had the main bed. Older children might share a mattress in the loft. Servants often slept on benches, in corners, even next to animals. In wealthier homes, the wet nurse, cook, or maid might have a curtained alcove, but no true privacy. In large homes, live-in apprentices shared rooms. In small homes, everyone shared everything. Illness meant rearranging beds. A death meant squeezing the coffin past the same staircase you used to carry firewood. Nothing stood still. Nothing was private. Life moved around itself like a tide. Death. In the house, most people died at home. There were no hospitals for ordinary illness. If you caught a fever, you stayed in bed. If you broke a leg, it healed crooked or didn't. Midwives delivered babies. Family members washed the dead. The same house that hosted weddings hosted funerals. The same fireplace that warmed a birth bed flickered beside a deathbed. And when someone died, the body was washed, wrapped, and laid out in the main room for visitors to pay their respects. It might take days for burial, longer in bad weather. The body stayed in the house. The children played near it. Meals were eaten nearby. Death wasn't separate. It was part of the house. Faith at the center, faith filled the Tudor townhouse, not with stained glass or choirs, but with ritual. A crucifix over the door, daily prayers by the hearth, psalms murmured while washing or cooking, grace before meals, blessings over the ill. Church services were communal, but spiritual discipline began at home. Households read aloud from English Bibles after Henry VIII's break with Rome. Devotion was not ornamental, it was routine. You lived in a world governed by providence. Illness, birth, storms, and crop failure were all seen as divine signals. And when a child died of fever, there was no therapy, only prayer, and the strength to go on. Would you have endured? The Tudor townhouse wasn't a place of quiet. It wasn't clean. It wasn't private, but it worked. Somehow, would you endure? Sleeping with lice and strangers, cooking beside manure, smelling tallow, mildew, and burning wool daily, waking to screaming pigs or dying kin, dressing in rough wool, washing your face with vinegar, and praying while your child's fever raged? You might, people did. And not because they were tougher, but because they had no choice. We forget that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it creaks like the beams of an old house. Sometimes it just gets through the day. The walls of your Tudor home are made of oak, straw, clay, and time. They've seen illness, laughter, birth, fire, and failure. They hold the residue of generations, not just in soot and dirt, but in ritual, rhythm, and repetition. You may look back at this world and feel pity, or maybe revulsion. But for those who lived within it, the Tudor townhouse was not squalor. It was life. And life, however grim by modern standards, had its moments of warmth, hope, and dignity. In this final section, we step back to examine what these homes tell us, not only about discomfort, but about how people endured it, adapted to it, and in their own quiet ways, owned it. A house never silent. You wake to church bells and bird calls, then hammering. Someone. Here's fixing shutters across the way. A seller yells about apples. A child shrieks, not in fear, just play. In the alley, someone is emptying a chamber pot with a splash. A Tudor townhouse was never quiet. Floors creaked, roofs groaned, pipes dripped if you had any. The wind howled through ill-fitted windows. And above it all, the constant buzz of human life, talking, coughing, praying, pacing, washing. If you think you'd find this intolerable, remember, most found it comforting. Silence was suspect. Noise meant life. Stillness meant someone had died. A day in the life by sunrise, the fire is rekindled. Someone is boiling water. You hear a spoon knocking against a metal pot. Porridge again, thick, oat-based, tasteless but hot. A blessing is said you eat standing up. If you're a servant, your tasks start now. Emptying ashes, fetching water, milking goats, brushing lint from the master's coat. If you're the lady of the house you're managing, deciding what can be sold, what must be repaired, who can be spared to help neighbors deliver a child or bury the dead. If you're a child, you learn by watching or by doing. Formal schooling is rare, especially for girls. Apprenticeships, chores, and observation take its place. Life is not measured in hours, but in chores completed, meals eaten, fires tended, medicine in the home. There are no pharmacies, no sterile hospitals. Most healing happens at home. Common treatments include onion poultices for chest congestion, leeching for swelling, boiled nettle tea for fatigue, vinegar cloths for fever, lard and soot for burns. Some of it worked, some didn't. But people trusted local healers, midwives, and the inherited wisdom of past generations more than distant physicians. Pain was a companion, not a crisis. You lived with it. You adapted, would you? Festivity amid the filth, not everything was hard. Tudor homes hosted feasts, songs, weddings, and games. On feast days or after harvest, the same hearth that cooked meager stew all year might roast a goose or bake spiced buns. People danced, played dice, told stories, laughed loudly, unself-consciously. Children made up songs while stomping in puddles. Neighbors drank ale and gossiped. Joy wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. You didn't clean the house to impress guests, you cleaned. The house's place in the city, your home, was not isolated. It was part of a street, a living, writhing network of neighbors, apprentices, gossips, widows, beggars, bakers, thieves. Children ran from door to door. Milkmaids shouted greetings. Church, bells announced the hour. Public punishment was performed in the square. The baker's fire was felt down the block. You didn't live alone. You couldn't. If your roof caught fire, the neighbors put it out. If your child got sick, someone brought herbs. If someone died, the street attended. The Tudor townhouse taught a harsh truth. Independence was a myth. You survived together, or not at all. Echoes in modern times today, we recreate Tudor homes as museums, tourist attractions, or Airbnbs with charming period features. But the charm only runs skin deep. The real Tudor home was cold, loud, dark, cramped alive, and yet its lessons endure. It shows us what people can survive without. Central heating, private bathrooms, running water, personal space, and what they can't survive without. Community, adaptation, ritual, and the ability to find joy in discomfort. Final reflection. Would you come home? Step into that Tudor townhouse now, as yourself. You duck under the low beam. You wrinkle your nose at the smoke. You try not to slip on the uneven floor. You hear coughing above, pigs grunting outside, and something boiling on the fire. It's hot, it's loud, it smells awful. But if you lived here long enough, would it change you? Would you learn not just to endure, but to accept? Would you come to see its routines, its rhythms, its resilience, not as suffering, but as a structure of life? Could you not just survive, but belong? It is early morning. Mist hangs low over the moors. The earth is soft from last night's rain, and your boots are already soaked. You carry a stretcher with 3 others. On it lies the body of your uncle, wrapped in linen, bound with rope, his feet facing forward, his chin tied shut. You are walking a corpse to its grave. This is not a funeral in the way you understand it. There is no hearse, no casket, no quiet line of black-draped mourners. This is a corpse road, and the dead must be walked to church, sometimes for miles. You do not talk. You do not look behind. You walk. Welcome to a forgotten part of English. Death, the long, often miserable, often terrifying journey from deathbed to consecrated ground. Why walk the dead? In medieval and early modern England, not every settlement had a churchyard. Some villages, especially those in remote moorland regions, or newer unofficial hamlets, lacked the legal or ecclesiastical authority to bury their own dead. Burial required consecrated ground, which only parish churches possessed. This meant that when someone died in one of these outlying settlements, their body had to be carried, sometimes for 10, 15, or even 20 miles, to the nearest official parish cemetery. These journeys followed what came to be known as corpse roads or lichways, from lich, the Old English word for corpse. And these roads weren't just logistical. They were sacred, symbolic, and filled with custom. Paths beaten by death corpse roads were typically narrow, unpaved paths that cut across hills, valleys, moorland, and forest. They were often the most direct route from village to church, regardless of terrain. You weren't allowed to take shortcuts through private farmland. You weren't supposed to divert the route. The corpse road was not just a convenience, it was a ritualized journey. Along these paths you'd find lich gates, wooden structures at churchyard entrances where the priest would meet the body, corpse stones or resting stones, flat rocks, where pallbearers could stop and set the body down for prayers or simply rest, crossing stones where the path intersected with others, marking spots of significance. Occasionally, wayside crosses to ward off evil or mark spiritual boundaries. Each of these elements formed a spiritual map. Walking the corpse wasn't just about moving a body, it was about guiding a soul. The burden of the dead imagined carrying a body, not in a polished coffin, but wrapped in cloth or placed in a simple wooden frame, across wind-blown fields and icy streams. In winter, in rain, in heat, with wolves once lurking in the woods, and thieves sometimes watching from behind trees. You might walk 5 to 10 hours uphill and down before reaching the church, and then you'd walk home again, empty-handed, often in silence. 2. Live in a remote part of England in this era meant not only surviving your own life, but carrying the weight of death across unforgiving land. Rules and taboos. The corpse road wasn't casual. There were customs. Many believed that once a body was taken along a corpse path, its spirit would follow that route forever. To divert it was dangerous, to the living and the dead. People buried shoes at crossroads to confuse spirits. Others placed pebbles on resting stones as offerings or markers of prayer. It was common to face the corpse feet first, so the dead couldn't look back at the home they were leaving. Whistling on a corpse road was forbidden. So was laughing. So was turning around. The road had rules. To break them was to invite misfortune, the church's authority over death. These long journeys were not just tradition, they were enforced by law. The medieval church held a monopoly on burial. Even if your village had land, you couldn't consecrate it yourself. To bury someone outside of a churchyard was illegal and seen as a threat to spiritual order. This meant the church controlled not only the lives of its flock, but their deaths, and the burden of obeying that control fell to the living poor. They paid mortuary fees, burial dues, and most painfully, in labor, by carrying the corpse themselves. Would you have questioned it? Or would you have walked the mile? Superstition of spirits. These roads were more than transport routes. They were spiritual battlegrounds. Many believed that spirits, especially those who died violently or unshriven, lingered along the corpseway. Some said you could hear whispering at resting stones. Others reported ghost lights, will-o'-the-wisp as dancing at dusk. A few believed that walking a corpse through a town could leave a residual spirit behind, especially if the route passed too close to someone's house. To avoid this, roads often skirted villages and avoided homes. The dead walked through the wilderness, not through the center of town. Imagine carrying a cousin, aunt, or child through a foggy moor, hours in silence, wind biting your ears, the earth squelching beneath your feet. You might feel grief, you might also feel fear, a communal undertaking, but you didn't walk alone. Corpse journeys were shared tasks. Neighbors took turns. Children watched and learned. Women often helped with preparations, washing the body, binding. The limbs wrapping the face to hold the jaw shut. In some areas, the entire village processed behind the corpse. In others, just 4 or 6 pallbearers made the trek. But always death was communal. No one was left to bury their dead alone. Today, we isolate death. Hospitals, morgues, private funerals. But then, death was visible. It moved through fields. It left footprints, it shaped the land. The corpse road made mourning a physical act. It's the late 15th century. You are walking behind a linen-wrapped body, the corners of the shroud damp from morning mist. The path beneath your feet is narrow, worn and uneven, a ribbon of flattened earth marked not by wheels, but by centuries of footsteps. Ahead is the parish church. Miles behind, the home the dead has just left. And between them, the corpse road, a path walked not once, but dozens, hundreds of times by others who died before. It is a pilgrimage of sorts. But the one traveling cannot pray, cannot repent, cannot return. The dead, it is said, must be shown the way. The geography of Death England's terrain often dictated the journey. Corpse roads cut across, moors like in Yorkshire, wide and exposed, prone to sudden fog. Forests like Sherwood, dense and hushed, where roots tripped the unwary. Streams and bogs, crossed by makeshift bridges or stepping stones. Mountain passes in places like Cumbria, where snow could block the way for days. Some routes were 10 or more miles long. In hard winters, corpses had to be stored in chapels or barns until thaw allowed burial. These roads were not the ones used for trade or travel. They were often separate, set apart, used only for this one solemn task, because once a road bore the dead, it was believed to belong to them. Haunted by custom superstition, surrounded these paths like mist. It was believed that a corpse once carried would imprint the route, creating a line of spiritual connection. Ghosts were thought to walk their corpse roads at night, retracing their final journey. To protect the living, certain precautions were taken. Resting stones were used not just for pause, but for prayer. Bodies were carried feet first to discourage the soul from turning around. When possible, a new path was avoided to prevent creating a new haunt. If a corpse road crossed a property line, people often built hedges or walls to contain spiritual residue. Some locals placed iron nails, salt or coins along the route to appease or ward off spirits. The belief wasn't that the dead were evil, it was that they were unsettled, and their path should not cross yours lightly. Church control and consecration. The parish church held power over where the dead could lie, and by extension, it held power over where the living had to carry them. Villages petitioned to build their own chapels, but few were granted burial rights, especially in feudal times, when centralized religious authority was vital for both spiritual and political control. This made burial logistics a question of status. The dead of wealthier villages might afford a cart, an escort, a proper casket, but for the poor, a shroud, a wooden board, and their own 2 feet. Disputes arose. In one 13th century case, a village in Devon attempted to bury its dead locally without permission. The church retaliated, excommunicating the entire community. The dead remained unburied until the villagers relented. Death in this way became not only a spiritual passage, but a jurisdictional one. Footprints on the land over time, corpse roads became part of the landscape. Locals knew them. Children were warned not to stray onto them after dark. Farmers built around them, not through them, but not all were marked. Some were simply known, by memory, by law, by use. You might recognize them today only by accident. A sunken narrow lane between old stone walls, a field edge where no crops are ever planted, a lichen-covered slab in a lonely glade, a path that always feels colder somehow. Historians and folklorists have attempted to trace these roads using maps, oral histories, and archaeological evidence. But many have vanished, plowed under, paved over, or simply forgotten. Their erasure is, in a way, a second death. The weight of the body, a human body, is heavy. An adult corpse in a wet shroud or wooden bier could weigh 150 to 200 pounds. Carried by 4 to 6 people over uneven ground, it was exhausting labor. Rotten rigor set in fast, especially in summer. Flies, heat, rain, and mud added further insult. In poor weather, the load might slip. In frost, your fingers might go numb. In flood, the path might vanish entirely. But still, you walked, because the alternative, leaving the body unburied or burying it in unconsecrated ground, was unthinkable. Not just socially, but spiritually. You did not do this for the dead alone. You did it to keep the living safe. A last view of the world, some corpse roads are said to align with corpse points. Natural places of elevation along the way where the body was lifted, so the deceased could see their home one final time. Did this actually happen? Perhaps not often, but the belief persisted. Even in death there was dignity, a goodbye, a moment to pause and remember what was being left behind. Standing at such a point, miles from the parish, wind cutting across your cheeks, you might feel the truth in your bones. The journey is long, the earth is cold, and you one day will be carried too. Death as a communal memory. What corpse roads preserved was not just ritual, but memory. They turned private loss into public effort. They mapped grief onto geography. They said, here is the path where we have carried our dead. Here is where we paused. Here is where we prayed. Here is where we laid them down. In a world without gravestones for the poor, without obituaries, without photographs, the road became the record. Every time someone walked it, they remembered who had walked it before. Even if their names were forgotten, their weight was not. It is the early 19th century. You still live near the old path, but something has changed. The corpse road is overgrown now, its resting stones cracked, the hedgerows swallowed by bramble. The lich gate creaks unused. No one has walked the dead this way in years. Your children don't know the route. Your neighbors don't speak of it. A horse-drawn cart now delivers the dead straight to the churchyard. The corpse roads are disappearing. But where do those memories go? When the ritual that preserved them vanishes, the end of The Walking Dead by the 1800s, several changes converged to make corpse roads obsolete. Transportation improved. Carts, carriages, and later hearses made long-distance burial easier and faster. Legal reforms gave more villages the right to bury their own dead. New burial grounds were consecrated, especially as cities grew. The Church of England loosened its grip on burial rites as religious plurality expanded. And perhaps most significantly, urbanization restructured how and where people died. As towns expanded, more people died in hospitals and workhouses rather than homes. The intimacy of the old corpse-carrying ritual gave way to professional undertakers and specialized burial services. What was once sacred labor became logistics. The ritual. Fade rituals tend to disappear, not with a shout, but a sigh. No one made an announcement. We shall no longer walk the dead. The roads were simply used less until they weren't used at all. Grass crept in. Stones were taken for building. Local knowledge faded, and with the loss of the ritual came a shift in how death was seen. Once death was a journey, shared, endured, spiritual. Now it became a service, scheduled, sanitary, distant. Would you notice the difference, living through that change? Or would you, like most, be relieved that the burden of the dead had finally been lifted, without realizing what had also been lost? The cost of convenience today. Death is outsourced. Hospitals sanitize it. Mortuaries refrigerated. Crematoriums industrialize it. Funerals are often brief, scripted, and separate from burial. These practices are efficient, respectful in their own way, but they lack the physical encounter that once defined mourning. There is no mud on your shoes, no silence on the moor, no aching shoulders from the weight of someone you loved. In the age of corpse roads, mourning was not passive. It was participatory. You knew grief because you felt it in your back, your lungs, your calves, because you walked it mile after mile. Lingering paths, lingering myths. Even after they were abandoned, corpse roads didn't vanish entirely. In some regions, particularly Yorkshire, Cumbria, Devon and Cornwall, the old routes lingered in local lore. A lane no one used after dusk, a path where no one built a house, a stone no one dared move, a footpath marked only on the oldest maps. Modern. Hikers sometimes report a strange quiet on these trails, a sense of being watched, a sudden chill. Folklorists document stories of phantom processions, lines of silent figures moving across fields on certain nights of the year. No torches, no sound, just the sense of a journey still underway. We don't walk the corpse roads anymore, but some believe the dead still do. Memory in the landscape. The English countryside holds layers of history, and corpse roads are part of that quiet archaeology. You can't always see them, but they're there. A curved hedge line that makes no sense, a bridle path that leads nowhere. A line of standing stones beneath moss. Walk long enough through the moors, and you might follow a path older than the church that once consecrated it. This is memory without monuments, the way ordinary people remember, not in marble, but in movement. How long could you carry it? Let's return to the burden. You are 16, your father has died. The ground is frozen, the corpse must be taken 7 miles to the next parish. You do not ride, you walk. Your hands are raw from cold rope. Your eyes are dry from holding in tears. The path is slippery, your shoes leak. The sky is slate grey. You arrive at dusk, lower him into consecrated earth and walk home. Would you survive the physical labor of death? Could you bear the silence of that return? In many ways, the corpse road was a test, not of strength, but of duty. What we've forgotten modern life gives us comfort. We don't carry our dead, we don't walk long miles in mourning. But something goes missing when we no longer touch the rituals that ground grief. We forget that mourning once had pace and shape, that memory lived not in stone, but in shared exertion. That grief, when moved by foot, becomes something else, not lighter but realer. Would you want to walk a corpse road today? Perhaps not. But would you be changed if you did? Almost certainly. Final reflection. Roads with no destination. The corpse road reminds us that not all journeys are meant to take the living forward. Some are meant to walk the dead back into memory. And when we forget the path, perhaps we forget the burden too. But the land remembers, the stones remain, and on cold nights, the wind still whispers. This is where the dead once walked. Your tooth has been aching for days. It started as a dull throb behind your right molar. Now it's sharp, deep, radiating through your jaw, into your temple, down your neck. You haven't slept. You can't chew. Even swallowing sends hot pulses of pain through your face. You pray. You press herbs to your cheek. You rinse with wine. Nothing helps. You live in medieval Europe. And the worst part is not the pain itself. It's knowing there's nothing that can stop it. Welcome to the long, slow horror of dental care, before drills, before antiseptics, before anesthesia. Tooth pain in a world without relief. Toothaches were one of the most common medical complaints in the medieval world. But treatment options were few, and understanding of dental disease was nearly non-existent. Cavities weren't seen as microbial in nature. They were often blamed on tooth worms, a mythical parasite believed to burrow into teeth and cause decay, sinful living, particularly gluttony or sloth, cold humors invading the head. There were no dentists as a separate profession. If you needed help, you saw a barber surgeon, a monk, or a local healer. And help didn't mean a root canal or a filling. It meant removal, brutal, immediate, and unforgettable. Barbers, blacksmiths, and tooth pullers. If you were lucky, your tooth might be pulled by a barber surgeon, a man trained in bloodletting, minor surgeries, and battlefield medicine. If you were unlucky, a blacksmith, tavern keeper, or roaming tooth drawer might offer to help for a price. They used pincers or iron tongs, often unclean, levers to wedge the tooth from below, a string tied to the tooth and yanked with force. In extreme cases, a hammer and chisel. There were no antiseptics, no sterilization, no numbing agents aside from strong ale or opium tinctures, if you could afford them. The tooth was extracted, often in parts, often with bone or gum tissue torn away. Many fainted, some screamed, some bled to death, slowly, from infection. And if the tooth broke mid-extraction, they went in again. Mouth care, such as it was, preventive care. Not quite. There were no toothbrushes, though tooth sticks, slim twigs chewed at the end, were used to clean teeth. People might rinse with vinegar, brine, or wine. In wealthier homes, cloths dipped in mint or sage oil were rubbed on teeth. Toothpastes, when they existed, were made from crushed eggshells, burnt bread, ground bones, honey, and herbs, but these were abrasive and often worsened enamel loss. Worse still, sweetened wine and honeyed foods were increasingly common among the elite, rot with every sip. Tooth loss was not rare. It was expected. The constant ache of the commoner. Most peasants lived with tooth pain. You didn't get help unless the pain was unbearable. Extraction cost money. And there was no sense removing a tooth just because it hurt. You might live for months or years with abscesses, rotting gums, cracked teeth, swelling that deformed the face, sinus infections caused by dental roots when infection turned septic. It could lead to death, misattributed to fever or bad humors. A cracked molar might turn into a facial fistula. You could drip pus into your mouth with every word. You adapted, or you didn't. A smile in the mirror of the time by middle age, many had lost most of their teeth. Portraits of nobility sometimes hide this fact with closed mouths and turned heads. Among the poor, gaps were visible and unremarkable. Bad breath, toothless smiles, swollen cheeks, these were part of daily life. You weren't expected to have a perfect smile. You were expected to survive with what you had. And yet, people still laughed, still sang, still ate, slowly, carefully, on one side of the mouth. They endured. Monks and medicinals monasteries preserved some of the best medical knowledge of the period. And monks often compiled herbals for various ailments, including toothache. Treatments included clove oil, still used today for its numbing properties, henbane or mandrake, narcotic herbs used to dull pain, garlic and vinegar compresses, hot, poultices applied to the cheek, smoking herbs like tansy or wormwood. These remedies might reduce pain, but they didn't cure decay. When herbs failed, the tooth came out. Tooth worms and terrible cures. Tooth worms, though imaginary, were taken very seriously. A popular treatment involved heating herbs in a funnel and directing the smoke into the mouth, hoping to coax the worm out. Another, dripping hot oil or metal filings into the cavity to burn the worm. Needless to say, these treatments caused more harm than good, but when you live in pain, any explanation is better than none, and any treatment is worth a try. You're seated on a stool. A man stands above you. His clothes smell of sweat and iron. In one hand, he holds a pair of iron tongs. In the other, your jaw. You taste metal and blood. Your feet are braced on a wooden floor still slick from the last patient. There are no gloves, no tools of precision, no mercy. And then he pulls. You scream. Welcome to dentistry in the medieval world. Not a science,